Dr. Anderson is a professor at the University of Guelph in Family Studies. Her popular book, A Recognition of Being, Reconstructing Native Womanhood, is currently under development for a second edition. She is also the co-author of Strong Women's Stories, Native Vision and Community Survival with Benita Lawrence. Dr. Anderson has published over 30 book chapters and journal articles. Her research interests lie in the areas of health and well-being of Indigenous families, gender and Indigenous peoples, community-based Indigenous research, oral history and Indigenous knowledge translation, and Indigenous environmental knowledge. She is currently the principal investigator with a SSHRC Partnership Development Grant entitled Bidewewidum, Indigenous Masculinities. I, like many people, are a huge fan of Dr. Anderson's work. It's a great pleasure to be able to have her here on campus. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Kim Anderson.
Thank you for that wonderful welcome. I really appreciate it. And I just want to say I'm so grateful to be here in the homelands of the Métis, Cree, and Anishinaabe, Treaty 1 territory. Feels good to be home. This is where my own people are from, although I was born and raised in Ottawa, and I've lived in Ontario all my life. And I also want to say Happy International Women's Day, and be mindful of those people that are fighting the good fight in terms of social justice, environmental justice. I know they have they've called for a general women's strike in the US today. And so I was gonna quit work today and not do anything, but I thought that might not be too fair to the people that planned this event. So that's it, I'm going home, goodbye. Just kidding, I'm actually gonna talk. And I also am really excited to be here in an environment where there's this thriving urban Indigenous living going on. And particularly grateful because I just came back from Sweden where I was working with the Sami. Forgive me if I'm a little burnt out because I actually flew yesterday, God knows how many hours, and made it in through the storm, so I'm kind of on a weird time zone and stuff. But I learned a lot while I was there about how marginalized the Indigenous peoples of Scandinavia are. And I became grateful for what we have here in these territories, in spite of all the struggles that we still have. So I just want to say that before I start. And one of the things that we have the opportunity to do here is make ourselves present in institutions such as this. So there's all this kind of wonderful work going on here that allows Indigenous peoples to have a voice, to have a presence. And this is one of the ways that we do it, right? So thank you for inviting me. So my cover image is sort of a play, of course, on Pocahontas. Pocahontas who are curious, like myself, and those who wish to push back against the images that define us. And so this talk is going to be a lot about how do we put ourselves back into those narratives, how do we flip them around, how can we use our bodies to do that, which is one of the things that I've done, especially at this time of Canada 150, and fighting against all those kind of ubiquitous settler nationalist narratives that, that we have to call attention to because they continue to contribute to our colonization and the violence that our peoples face. So here's some of my postcards from Sweden. This one is I was walking down the street and I saw a shop about exotic art. And of course, indigeneity is one of those things that's been, I see you laughing. Indigeneity is one of those things that's been appropriated and sold. We have to see those stupid dream catchers everywhere we go, in every corner of the world now, right? Those Anishinaabe dream catchers. So I took a picture of this. I was in the window. You can see my shadow there. And I'm like, oh, man, I'm going to take a picture. I'm going to do a little photo essay on this. And I was traveling with Robert Innes. I don't know how many of you know Rob. But so I put it up. And I'm like, yeah, this is the sort of shit that you see. And Rob's laughing, and he sends it back. And I said, well, what are you laughing about? And he says, well, look at what's in the picture with your shadow there in the exotic art. And I'm like, oh, my God. And I remembered. Actually, I have seen those. They sell them in, I think in Morocco, there's like, that's one of their main like souvenirs that you see. Anyway, who knows what the hell that's about, but I just thought I'd give you a little postcard. Happy International Women's Day. So we can laugh about all this kind of ridiculous things that we find about ourselves, but you know, we have these sort of commodifications of indigeneity, in particular of Indigenous women and men gendered images that continue to be used. So I was continuing my walk. This is in Lund in Sweden, in the southern Sweden. And I'm walking along just trying to get some air before my speaking engagement, and I run into this on this huge university building. And I'm kind of like, what the fuck? You know, what is that? And so I go inside the building, and I say to the woman who's selling, like it was a university bookstore, and I said, I'm hoping this is some kind of like subversive art show that, you know, whatever. She's like, oh no, it's a really funny musical we had, and the students loved it. It was on last year, so we're gonna have it on Friday night. You know, this really hilarious musical. So I'm like, oh, okay. So anyway, I brought a poster of it if anybody wants to come and have an International Women's Day thing. I was gonna take it and put like a line through it and put it up, but I'll leave it here as a gift and a souvenir for anybody who's interested. So Pocahontas, of course, we've had to endure, it feels like centuries, well, it has been centuries of misrepresentation of who we are as Indigenous women, and it becomes, of course, exoticized and commodified. And as much as people, I mean, I don't have to explain any of this to this crowd, right? I'll just move on. We know what this means. We know it means to ourselves that no matter how pretty they make it, it still is about defining us in such a way that contributes to the violences that Indigenous women and girls, two-spirited peoples, trans women experience on a day-to-day basis because of those exoticizations of us and the fact that they're connected to promiscuity, sexualities that are open and available, narratives about us being open, easy, and available to the white male who's gonna come and, you know, conquer and consume, and then therefore have this kind of sense of belonging and entitlement to the lands, right? That's what the narrative is all about, which you can see here. Oops, I'll move this over here. So I've written about that, as have many. And one of the things that I've just started getting into is talking about Indigenous men and masculinities, as was mentioned in the introduction. And of course, we also, I don't have to tell this crowd, we're familiar with the stereotypes of Indigenous men, either as the noble savage, the bloodthirsty warrior, or the drunken Indian. We also know how those narratives and those stereotypes contribute to the violences that Indigenous men experience on an everyday basis. You know, the work that we need to do is to think about how these narratives are ongoing and how they continue to pop up in unexpected places, much like me wandering around in southern Sweden, and there's Pocahontas larger than life in a funny musical, right? So one of the things that I've discovered in my scholarship around stereotypes around Indigenous men and masculinities is if the stereotypes about Indigenous women have been about you know, sexually promiscuous and opening the land for the white male settler subject, the ones about Indigenous men as the bloodthirsty warrior have been about like the white guy being able to beat the Indigenous male subject and therefore gain access to the lands and be able to be entitled, right? That's one of the stereotypes that we have. The contradiction between the gentleman, the white male gentleman, the Canadian, you know, male gentleman, and the savage, and the fault line in between. So where do we see these narratives popping up again and again? Does anybody remember this? Who remembers this? Does everybody remember this? Do I need to explain this to the crowd? It was a celebrity boxing match between Trudeau and Brazeau in 2012. At the time, I remember thinking to myself, again, what the fuck, you know? Does anybody else in Canada notice how crazy this is and how this really is another example of the gentleman and the savage narrative? Is anybody else paying attention to this? But of course, when you looked at the discourse in the media, none of it was attention to that. It was all kind of like this, you know, WWF kind of fun stuff about the pretty boy Trudeau and the Algonquin agitator. And of course, the two contenders played up those narratives and made something of it. And so it carried on to the point where, of course, they had the fight, and it only lasted 3 minutes, we remember. Trudeau, of course, won. And Brazeau, as a result of losing, had to have his hair cut off. Now, think about this narrative, right? Of all the hundreds of people that work in Trudeau's PR machine, which was working very hard at this point to help him gain access to the Liberal leadership because he was an MP at that time. Remember, he was an MP. So he's trying to become leader of Liberal Party, and of course, he went on to become our beautiful Prime Minister that everybody loves around the world. And so one of the things that he had to do was assert his masculinity, because the conservative attack ads and so on were, you can look this up, right? And they were going on about his masculinity and, oh, he was a drama teacher and, whatever, right? All these things about his masculinity. So in order to prove that he was like worthy of being the leader of our Liberal Party and of a country, he had to prove he had this kind of white masculinity, gentlemanly masculinity. And the way he does that, of course, beat up an Indian, which, is how it played out. I know he didn't challenge Brazeau. It wasn't the first one he challenged, but that's the way it worked out. So all this is unfolding. Like, does nobody in his PR machine say, well, you know what, that's kind of a bad idea. Like, if we consider the history of Canada, maybe that's not the way for you to assert your white male subjectivity. And plus, where's the dignity in that, I say to myself. But anyways, it seemed to be the only one who was questioning this. And nobody in his campaign would have said, you know what, cutting the hair off an Indian in the House of Commons as a result of beating him is probably not a good idea at this point in Canada to be able to, make yourself seem prime ministerial. Or is it? Or is it a good idea to do that? To make yourself seem like you're the guy that we want to continue to lead ourselves as we pride ourselves in this, Canadian settler nationalism. So, okay, we know what happened with that one, right? So these things continue and carry on, and we need to challenge them because we need to call attention to what it actually means in terms of us and our lives, our Indigenous lives. So this is, of course, just another kind of, we can have fun with it, we can play with the images, and we also need to be serious about what it means. Traveling with Rob Ennis, I said we did, I think, 8 or 9 speaking engagements in Sweden on Indigenous men and masculinities. And at one point I said, you know what, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do a presentation about the Trudeau-Brazeau fight, which is something I developed earlier and I've talked about in other settings. I said, because I'm kind of tired of listening to the other things we've been talking about. And plus, it'll be kind of fun, and everybody loves Trudeau. And I said, and it's kind of funny. And Rob said, yeah, it is funny, but you have to remember it's also very serious because it's about the lives of boys and men and how the stereotypes play into that violence. So we're mindful of that. So Rob and I have been working on Indigenous men and masculinities and flipping some of these narratives around. And this is just a shameless plug for a book that we had that came out about a year ago. One of the things we're trying to do is call attention to sort of really the diverse places that we come from in terms of our gendered identities and how they can be expressed and how we can support each other and how we can just start to dismantle all those harmful stereotypes and narratives that continue to define us, right? So now we find ourselves at Canada 150. We're here. And so what are we going to do at this time in terms of disrupting, reminding, and creating new narratives about what it means to be living in these territories together? I pulled this off the Canada 150 website, and this is the picture they had, and I thought, geez, look at all those white arms in the air. It looks like a Trump rally. Again, they have a big staff. Did nobody kind of notice that perhaps that's not the best picture to put up, especially at this time? Anyway, being an Indigenous scholar, of course, people call upon me to be, the critical voice around Canada 150 celebrations, and I've chosen to do that here. But my university, I just started at the University of Guelph, and so they had one of the people that writes for the university website come and talk to me because he was going to do this story it's like the contenders again, right? Like the professors that's thinking that Canada 150 is good, and I get to be the naysayer, right? So I am, of course, like any Indigenous person, I am a bit of a naysayer when it comes to Canada 150. But I also try to consistently be positive and think about what's possible and think about what is there to celebrate, how can we possibly make something of this year. What are we going to do about it? And again, coming from the experience that I've just had in the last 2 weeks, being in Sweden and seeing in general the Indigenous peoples of Scandinavia, how that erasure is ongoing and happening, I am grateful that we're allowed to sit, not allowed, we're sitting here in this room together, Indigenous peoples, settler peoples, and we're able to have this discussion, we're able to make space for those Indigenous voices. So, that being said, what to do about this guy? What to do about this guy for Canada 150? I don't have to tell this crowd again why there's not a whole lot to celebrate about the legacy of Sir John A. But I do have to talk about that in other spaces. And you would think that perhaps in university spaces, we don't really need to talk about why celebrating this particular Prime Minister as Indigenous peoples or as peoples in Canada in general, celebrating without looking at what's so highly problematic about that would need to be done. However, this is a story about how we do need to call attention to these things, even in these institutions of higher learning, because these ongoing narratives and celebration of characters such as Sir John A. continue. And one of the things that, when I ran up against this myself on my campus, and I'll tell that story in a second, one of the things that I did was I said, okay, well, when we come up against these narratives, we have role models in terms of artists, scholars, and other people who can tell us how to kind of give the finger to some of these things and take it out and play with the stereotypes, flip them around and do whatever. So I'm just putting some of these of my role models up here of how do we play with those settler nationalist narratives? How do we play with issues around gender? And how do we use those opportunities to educate the public about what it is that we're pushing back against, right? Here is another picture from with me and with my new buddies, my new Sami friends in Sweden. And in this case, we were in Uppsala. It's and a university goes back to the 1400s. And so I was at a conference there. I was speaking at a conference, and a lot of the conference, unfortunately, it was a mixture, but there was still some things that made me feel uncomfortable, which was kind of European anthropologists talking about the investigations they were doing around different Indigenous peoples in the north, in the Arctic. So at one point, my Sami friend said, come on, let's go and investigate this building. There's a museum in here, which you see us standing in front of, which is like a lot of the Scandinavian history, this kind of celebration of a Viking past, which of course totally erases the Indigenous peoples. It's also, very much, if you want to talk about gender, celebration of men, and all the kind of stuff we could see on that TV show, The Vikings, which I actually did watch after I went to Iceland. I gotta watch that TV show, The Vikings, right? But anyway, so we're in this conference in a building that's a part of the university. It goes back to the 1400s. And across the street in the cathedral is where Linnaeus is buried, the scientist that came up with the 4 races of man. So there's all sorts of problematic stuff around Indigenous peoples, racial biology, science that goes back, several hundreds of years that has impacted us, right? And upstairs in the building, so we go to the museum, and there's all this kind of thing around the Vikings and so on. And the woman that you see in the picture was, she's a Sami archaeologist, so she's talking all about the archaeology that actually demonstrates certain Sami presence that gets erased. And then we go up into the anatomical theater. It's called an anatomical theater. It's a building with like all these seats that go up, and you look down on a very steep level on this slab, and that's where they used to dissect the corpses for the med students, or for, this is going back to the 1400s, right? So they're learning about biology and so on from their professors. But it's really problematic because across the street there's another building that continues to hold Sami bones. of the ancestors of the people that I was visiting with. There's photographs. There was all sorts of racial biology work that was going on around, measuring people's heads and all that kind of stuff. So this is still held within those institutions, in spite of the challenges presented by Sami activists and, in fact, scholars like the ones I was with. My friends were an archaeologist and a psychologist. So my new buddy, Jan Petter, just says, I'm going to get on that slab and you take a picture of me. So that's what you see, is he's laying on the slab and I'm up in the rafters peering down at him, taking a picture of him laying on the slab. So I just bring that again as another example of, he was using his body to disrupt. And again, just kind of like, hello, what does this all mean, right? So I'll keep talking and see, where am I going here? I count on PowerPoint to keep me on track. Yeah, and I think the thing about using your bodies, it's about using that, being present, having this embodied presencing, which counteracts that invisibility that happens to us. So now I'm going to tell a story about what happened on the campus of the university I was working at up until December, which I loved working at Laurier. It was a fantastic place, and many of my colleagues, I'm really sad to leave there. But this is what happened a couple years ago. So this guy, can anybody guess who it is? First guess, I'm sure you'll get it. Who is it? No, it's not Laurier, actually. There is a statue of Laurier. Who else is it going to be? Let's put it this way. This is part of an initiative to celebrate the Canada 150. It's Sir John A. Macdonald, of course. So here's what happened. There was a citizens group in Kitchener-Waterloo, which is where Wilfrid Laurier University is located, that decided they wanted to do a Canada 150 initiative. So they got this money together, and they were going to commission 22 larger-than-life bronze statues of all Canada's prime ministers. It's a great idea, right, for a Canada 150 project. And so they got rolling on this, and they were going to put them in this small park in the middle of Kitchener, the city of Kitchener. And the city council decided, in their wisdom, thank goodness, again, this is more to celebrate, well, perhaps we should ask the citizens if they want this. And they did, and the citizens were like, no thanks, no way, right? The citizens voted it out. So somehow or other, this got around to the Wilfrid Laurier University Waterloo campus, and they decided, without consultation with the campus community, without passing it through Senate, that they would take the 22 statues of Canada's prime ministers. Now, this is problematic for a whole bunch of reasons, governance of the university being one of them. But so they passed it through Board of Governors, and up went the first statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, which you see here. Now, this is, I don't know how many of you have visited Wilfrid Laurier University, but it's a fairly small campus. So you can imagine having 22 of these up on the campus. You wouldn't be able to move, right? You'd be bumping into stuff. So anyways, up it went. And people just started to say, like, what the hell is that, right? So let's see. Oh, yeah. So what do? This is me and Leanne Letty, two history professors. And when I saw it, I was walking across I taught on another campus, and I was on the Waterloo campus to do some, I was in a meeting, and I was going to get my coffee, and I was like, what? I saw this statue. I cannot believe that. I want to go and put a noose around my neck and hang and stand up on that chair, right? And remember, I'm Métis, right? So I'm like, okay. So I went back to my own campus, and I was talking to the academic program assistant, and I said to her, can you believe that freaking thing? And I said, you know what? I want to go and stand on that chair. And she says, oh, if you do that, you're going to be my hero. So I said, that's it. I'm going to do something. So I talked to Leanne, and we both have PhDs in Canadian history. And I said, come on, we're going to go do something. So we cooked up this idea.
Get over it.
Quit talking about the past.
I'm not responsible for something my ancestors did.
This is what we're often told as Indigenous peoples living in Canada. Sometimes conversations happen without us knowing our part in them. As a kid growing up in that nation's capital, I was immersed, uneducated, not thinking about who gets the bridges and who's on the summit, who gets celebrated and who gets erased. But sometimes it catches you deep. The first time I saw it, I wanted to stand on one of those chairs and hang a noose around my neck to give my truth about what he did. I was walking across my university campus, looking for coffee, not the haunting trouble of history or my Cree Métis family's place in it. They're telling stories now of truth and reconciliation, but there it was, that story that I learned of two founding nations, newly erected. Instead of hanging, it was time to take a seat. It was me and my colleague Leanne, two Native women with PhDs in Canadian history, not the kind of Indians Sir John A. had in mind when he hung our leaders and put our children in residential schools. Grandfathers, forgive our dark humor, for we are mindful of all the Indigenous men who fill the jails today. Nimishomas, Big Bear, and Poundmaker. Nimishomas, who protected the starving and impoverished people. Nimishomas, who suffered the cold seats of Stony Mountain Prison at the hand of Sir John A. Macdonald. Nimishomas, who were not part of that conversation. Macdonald was knighted by Queen Victoria for his primary role in crafting the British North America Act, which established the Canadian nation on July 1, 1867. He rallied support across the West and encouraged British Columbia into confederation by promising a railway to the Pacific, completed in 1885. Macdonald established the Northwest Mounted Police, now the RCMP, to provide order and security for Western settlers. A much-loved leader? It's Halloween, so our friends and allies hand out treats and truths to passers-by. We bring Louis Riel into the conversation and follow his words because sometimes it catches through the generations. Leanne and I are joined by my son, who brings life to our truths. And we join many others who write letters and make presentations about racial wallpapering, great white man narratives, and the aesthetics of commemoration. Collectively, and eventually, we bring it down. The sirs of the world don't like us playing with the iron hand of history. But this is exploration, discovery, commemoration. And what else to do but dance on the graves of this kind of representation? So that's kind of like my FU Canada 150, right? But I am also grateful because one of the things that happened at Laurier when this went up was I realized how many allies and how many brilliant people there were on my campus to be able to challenge it. So I found new heroes, and one of them was Jonathan Finn, who's the chair of the communications department at Laurier, and he started a petition. So Leanne and I were a couple people among many, many people on campus who were like, no way, this isn't going to happen. And Jonathan did this petition, which you can see went up on, and had all sorts of people commenting and joining in. One of the things that they challenged was if we're going to have this kind of climate on the university around diversity, respect, and we're talking about truth and reconciliation, what the hell, like how is this going to help our Indigenous students to feel safe on campus, to feel that their voices are important, and not to feel like there's these ongoing violences in the spaces that we find ourselves. So there was tons of opposition, of course, starting with the city folks in Kitchener. There was all sorts of, this is outdated in terms of the signatures. You saw the signatures. There was like 1,200 signatures or so on the petition. The Senate, and we brought it to Senate at Wilfrid Laurier University, and they voted against it, and so on. So there was lots of resistance for all sorts of reasons. Jonathan Finn, who put up the original petition and who took the leadership, also took a lot of the hits from the public, and he received a whole bunch of hate mail. And this is some of the things that were said about him and to him in the hate mail that he received as a result of spearheading a campaign to take the statue down. And our university's response wasn't, just to immediately take the statues down at the beginning, because they were in all of this tricky situation, I suppose, at having accepted, and the citizens group that wanted to have it up. So they created a commission to examine. But these were the questions that the commission was supposed to ask, and it's this thing that we get caught up in all the time about how, well, how can we, Canada's a great country and there's lots of great things, and you guys are like raining on our Canada 150 parade because, we got to celebrate all this wonderful stuff. And again, we get kind of positioned as the naysayers, and that we're, this is, again, familiar to many of you, how we become kind of like the troublemakers, or the problematic ones. And so I've done some other panels around Canada 150, and some of the resistance comes back around, oh, well, you're at risk of putting people who want to celebrate Canada, you're gonna make them feel more marginalized and so on. So this is another tricky situation we find ourselves in. But we have tons and tons of smart allies, as I learned at Laurier. And as I said to the senior administration when I've been, talking publicly or put up the YouTube video, I said, this is actually, to me, a demonstration of why it's a fantastic place, right? Why it was a good place to work, because all these people said things about it and called attention to the fact that we're an educational institution. It's our job to be able to make those spaces where we can have discussions that are truly about truth and reconciliation, are truly about what Canada 150 means. Not just about, all those white arms in the air holding the flag up like what we saw. So one of the things that perhaps I'll end with, because I think I got to end in terms of being able to have some questions, is just reading a little bit from one of my colleagues, Marta Marin-Domine, who wrote in. She studies commemoration. She works as the co-director of the Center for Memory and Testimony Studies at Laurier. And so I'll just read this as a way of perhaps opening it up to some questions and dialogue. So she wrote, one of the major trends of recent decades has been a critical approach to monumental history. If the trend until World War I had been to erect monuments to the heroes of the nation, in the late 20th century, historical attention has turned to recognizing the suffering of collectivities and to memories of collective resistance. One solution to this seeming contest of memories in the 21st century has been the creation of memorials that recognize the tension between official history and the history of regular men, women, and children, which is, after all, the real tissue of any community and country. Let us not forget that memorials, whether statues or museums, are interactive spaces where bodies as well as minds engage in the dialectical relation with the past. In them, past and present become alive. This is the reason why so many artists today are critical of statues and prefer to speak of counter-monuments, of memorials in dialogue with their environment, urban, natural, and human. Our suggestion is that Canada and Canadians are sorely in need of serious public reflection on the politics of memory. That task will not be easy, but it would be fascinating. Debates will give rise to tensions, but tensions will perhaps make the multiple and vigorous imaginaries of Canada and Canadians manifest. Thank you very much.